Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. The death toll still rising as 60,000 Americans have now lost their lives to COVID-19 and counting. But there are some promising signs that a new drug could help treat the virus.
The data shows that remdesivir has a clear-cut, significant positive effect in diminishing the time to recovery.
All right, so let's bring in now our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman, to discuss that new drug plus other developments as it relates to the virus.
News gets even better, Rich, because there's actually two bits of good news on the therapeutic front. Fauci says the drug, remdesivir, which has been used to help people fight Ebola, helped reduce the recovery time of COVID patients in preliminary testing of around 1,100 people. There's also anecdotal evidence of some benefit. The FDA will allow emergency use prescriptions for COVID now within days. This as Pfizer announced it's ready to jump into emergency testing for a possible COVID vaccine as soon as next week. It's now the fourth potential vaccine, all from different sources, being readied for fast-track testing. Pfizer is already testing this drug on people in Germany. Next up, the massive debate over the president's invocation of the Defense Production Act to order meat and poultry processing plants to reopen or stay open. He's doing it to allay the very real worries of interruptions to the nation's food chain, but the president did not add any required safety protocols to plant operators, though the CDC did publish new voluntary requirements. Problem is, tightly packed meat and poultry plants are already hotbeds of the virus and have been identified as the source of at least 4 major outbreaks across the country. At least 20 meat packers have died from COVID-19, 6,500 have tested positive, and many have spread the virus beyond their plants and into the wider community. Other news, we have not seen much of Jared Kushner since the pandemic outbreak began, though we're told he's leading a shadow task force on the business side of the response. Kushner, in an interview today, displaying the same tone deafness as his father-in-law. He told Fox and Friends that much of the nation could be back to normal by June and, quote, the hope is that by July the country is really rocking again. No health experts of note agree with that, but before you hear from Kushner in his own words, this reminder. As of 4 p.m. today, 60,207 Americans had lost their lives to COVID-19, more Americans than were killed in Vietnam and higher than the White House's projections. Plus, more than 1 million Americans have had confirmed cases. And yet, despite those numbers, Kushner still felt confident enough to say this.
We've achieved all the different milestones that are needed. So the government, federal government, rose to the challenge, and this is a great success story. And I think that that's really, what needs to be told.
Wouldn't worry about that, sir. The story of this White House's response to the virus will certainly be told. Which brings us to the ongoing fight over aid to state and local governments. States are blowing holes in their budgets fighting the virus. But Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is refusing to help, calling that a blue state bailout. Florida's Rick Scott has piled on as well. On the other side of the argument, almost every other governor in the country who have found voice in New York's Andrew Cuomo. Cuomo has not been quiet, attacking McConnell for suggesting that states should go bankrupt. Cuomo noting again today that New York and other blue states give far more money to Washington than they get back, while he also noted that McConnell's Kentucky and Scott's Florida are among the top recipient states of federal money, points that Cuomo more than noted today.
What an ugly sentiment. How dare they? How dare they when those are the facts? How long are you going to play the American people and assume they're stupid? They are not. And they can add. And they know facts.
Rich?
And they also know decency, Andrew. Thank you very much. All right, I want to bring in our guest, Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney, a Democrat from New York, and he represents parts of the Hudson Valley. Congressman, a lot to get to. I really appreciate you giving me a few minutes. Thank you.
You bet.
Well, let's first start off with this whole premise of this blue state bailout, and I'll use my words, but that there'd be almost extortionary concessions if states, because of the pandemic, most adversely hit, if they're going to get state aid to pay for first responders, cops, et cetera. They're going to have to basically make concessions to get funding. We've shown the math that New York always gives more than it gets but yet the McConnells of the world, they're holding basically the money over the New York, the Californias, the New Jersey's heads here. To me, it's more than just, really distasteful politics. This is obscene.
Yeah, it's outrageous. And this is a fight worth having. And people need to understand that up to now, we have understandably been focused on the short-term relief efforts, getting cash payments to people, getting help to our small businesses, making sure that works for local small businesses, getting help out there to folks who are struggling to put food on the table, to make sure that the unemployment benefits are available to everyone who needs them. But increasingly, we have to focus on the structural and recovery components of this. We have to make sure states in the bullseye like New York get the help we need. They've already been screwing us, on things like people's state and local property tax deductions. Some of us want to bring those back in full right now as a way to help states like New York, but more broadly, help directly to the state, to the counties, to our cities, municipalities. The Democratic proposal in the last round of negotiations would have brought back $16 billion in total to the state of New York, and a bunch of that would have gone directly to local government. So it would really matter when local governments start looking at their budgets around essential services, around things like schools, around things like all the first responders and frontline workers who are key every day, but especially now. So this is a fight worth having. You're going to see some of us go to the mattresses on this one.
And just as a reminder, Republicans who voted for this president will be harmed just as much as Democrats who didn't. I know they put this in stark political terms with blue and red here, as if there was financial mismanagement that led to the devastation instead of the pandemic. All right, I want to play a soundbite from yesterday. You sit on a lot of important committees, including intelligence. I want to get your reaction to what the president said yesterday.
Many very good experts, very good people, too, said that this would never affect the United States. It wouldn't affect Europe. It wouldn't affect anything outside of China. So we were listening to experts, and we always will listen to experts. But the experts got it wrong. A lot of people got it wrong.
Congressman, that's just not true. The Washington Post reported, you go back to January and February, there was at least a dozen, if not more, references to the real national security threat of COVID that were in his daily intel briefings that they also go on to report that apparently he's not even looking at. The idea that no one knew this was coming, that's not true.
Yeah, it's absolutely not true. I mean, anyone reading the New York Times knew it was coming. We had weeks of notice because it began on the other side of the world, and we squandered that opportunity. But I'll tell you what, let's declassify everything having to do with COVID-19. How about that? As a member of the Intelligence Committee, I would call for a declassification on everything. We ought to see those presidential daily briefs. We ought to see the information made available to my committee. We ought to make available to the public exactly what their government, what your government knew and when it knew it, and let the chips fall where they may. When the dust settles, we should have a bipartisan national commission, like the 9/11 Commission, like the Warren Commission after the Kennedy assassination, that really digs into everything we knew, when we knew it, what we did, didn't do, not to ascribe blame, although accountability is important, but to learn the lessons. There are real, specific, concrete things we can do better, we can do differently, so that we are never in this position again.
Congressman, I know you've spoken out that a lot of small businesses are not getting the loans they need to stay afloat right now. We've seen a lot of reporting, and I've spoken to folks who say, well, part of the problem is the Small Business Association, they're not in this. This was outsourced to the banks, and it in many cases depended on who you knew and who the banks had prior relationships with that you could get to the front of the lines. How much of the problem is money not going to the people who need it most, let alone, by the way, going to some folks who shouldn't be getting it, and even bad actors who've had to pay federal fines here who are getting money instead of some of those small businesses? Is it the problem of who decides who gets the money, or that there's no really, accountability or vetting in terms of oversight of this?
Well, what we really have to do is we have to make sure the system is set up to make it easier and more efficient for the small banks, the community-based financial institutions, the credit unions, the smaller banks like the ones we have in the Hudson Valley, to get access to these funds and get them out the door to our local small businesses. The first round had a bunch of problems with it. Now, it was always going to be messy because the whole idea was to move fast so that we could get relief out there quickly. So some of that's not surprising. But what is outrageous is when 44% of the original tranche of money went to 4% of the applicants, when publicly traded companies and large restaurant chains are scooping up pools of $10, $20 million when that would fund every small business loan in Putnam County, probably. The fact is that we have to downsize the size of these loans, and we have to prioritize the small institutions that serve the family businesses. I think it's getting better, but I'm not satisfied with how our local businesses have been helped so far.
You sit on the Agriculture Committee. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's confused. We see pictures of millions of gallons literally being poured down the drain every day, crops being destroyed, culling of herds. And yet we see images like this where you have miles and miles of people online at food banks in San Antonio and Arkansas. Yesterday, they ran out of food at a food bank. Is there a more efficient way that we can make this supply chain work right now? Or is this just, an inevitability?
That's a great question, Richard, because what we are seeing is exactly that. We're seeing that we're having real problems at processing plants that is leading to the euthanization of tens of thousands of hogs, for example. And at the other end of the spectrum, we're seeing people struggling with food, and at food banks. Part of the problem is that the distribution system is not lined up so that you can redirect it easily from large processing plants or plants that service, say, restaurants in one form to putting it on, the shelves at a grocery store. But those are the kind of contingency plans that we need to put in place so that we are ready for these kind of disruptions. I know there's been some headlines around dumping of milk, but the fact is that the state of New York has now done a good job of purchasing that milk and redirecting it to food banks. Milk can be redirected pretty easily. I actually think agriculture in New York will hold up pretty well. I've got legislation that would forgive small farmers loans along the lines of forgiving these other loans that we're doing for other types of businesses. That would be a big shot in the arm to our local agriculture. That legislation is being introduced today, I believe, in Washington. Senator Gillibrand's carrying that with me and some other members from New York. If we can get some things like that done, we'll really help our local farmers too.
Finally, Congressman, in the big scheme of things, these next two things, they shouldn't bother as much as others, but they're just, to me, so symptomatic of every day being let down. Yesterday, we saw Vice President Pence, who, by the way, is head of the COVID task force, refusing to put on a face mask at the Mayo Clinic. And if you're at the Mayo Clinic, chances are you got a real acute problem. And now, in your district, you got the president who's going to be delivering the commencement address at West Point in June. And every cadet's got to come back from all over this country, sit in 2 weeks in quarantine, possibly, at least increase the risk of exposure for what I will bet good money will largely be a campaign rally speech. And my only point is, I don't care who anyone voted for, but every day you get division, you get no accountability, you get no leadership here, let alone any empathy. And I just think the American public deserves better. And again, that's not on any partisan lines here, but, I just think of guys like you almost have to work in spite of the executive branch here, setting an example.
There's a lot in that question. And right now, guys like me, I think, serve our constituents best when we just look at the problems and try to fix them. And when we get through the crisis, I think we're all going to have some very tough questions to answer. And the election will be the right time to say, what do we think of the leadership of this country right now? Can we do any better? Is this really the best we can do? Because I think we can do a heck of a lot better, and the people I represent sure deserve it.
Good enough. Congressman, thank you so much. I appreciate the time as always.
Thank you, Richard.
And up next, coronavirus, it is taking a huge toll on our nation's veterans. After the break, we're going to show you how the president's breaking his promise and our compact as a nation to take care of our vets like they've been taken care of never before. His words.